5 cave divers planned a dive deep in the caves of Norway. They wanted to be the first to obtain footage of a deep cave there, because no one had filmed the entire route before. They understood the dangers and the risks of the sport, and they had a healthy respect for the challenges they were taking on. That's why each and every diver in the group had 100% trust in each other before going into the dive. But what happened when things started going wrong left 2 of the divers in the cave for 7 weeks, and it would take an illegal operation to get them out. I'm Tatiana, and this is Occurrence. The morning of the trip on February 6, 2014, everyone was in a good mood. All 5 divers were excited to dive the full route and record it for others to see, since they were part of the few people that had ever been in the cave before. In the group, there was Vesa Rantanen, Patrick Gronquist, Kai Konkinen, and 2 other divers named Jari. One was Jari Huotarinen, who I'm going to call H, and the other was Jari Usamaki. I'll call him U. So where they were diving was located in central Norway at the end of Plura Valley. The valley is near a town of Mo i Rana and has mountains on both sides of it. The mouth of Plura Cave is a few hundred meters from the mountain base and part of a 115-foot or 35-meter wide underground river. So the entrance is a pond, and from there they go underground to reach depths of over 130 meters. They swim 0.6 miles or 1 kilometer through the cave system before coming out on the other side. In the cave of Stein, which I'll call Stein or the dry cave. From there they exit the water inside of the dry cave and climb up 295 feet or 90 meters to exit through the side of a collapsed hill. It's essentially just a very difficult and challenging sump. So I kind of want to paint a picture for the people not on YouTube and unable to see this picture. So from the Plura entrance, they swim horizontally through the cave and swim across for almost 1 kilometer. Just before the kilometer mark, part of the cave branches off and goes down. They swim down from that point to 135 meters deep before the cave starts turning back up. The part where the cave turns back up is at the 1 kilometer mark as it ascends back towards the surface. The cave actually continues going out further than 1 kilometer, but the path back up curves until the dry cave is technically 1 kilometer from the Plura entrance. So the path they're taking is technically deeper than 135 meters if you consider surface level and don't start counting at the start of the water table level. And they're technically swimming farther than 1 kilometer, but the way it's set up makes it seem a little less than what it actually is. I hope that makes sense. Part of the plan to dive from Plura to Stein was to leave gear overnight and come back the next day. They were split into 2 teams for the dive to account for how tight and difficult it would be, but also because of silt. So Team 1 was H and Patrick. They were supposed to make a hole in the ice from the Plura side. It was February and Norway, so the pond was frozen over and there was a decent amount of snow on the ground. Team 2 was Vesa, Kai, and U. They were supposed to take the second set of equipment to Stein Cave before starting their dive roughly 2 hours after Team 1 started, when the silt would hopefully be settled. Once H and Patrick made the hole and were ready, Team 2 told them that the path and equipment on their end was also ready. So Team 1 debated if they should wait for Team 2 to make it back to them before they started the dive, and chose to just get going. They checked the water and it was really clear. They checked their tanks, especially their extra ones for the trip back, and for if they ran into any problems, and made note that they had 1 extra tank. Then they were off. The beginning of Team 1's dive went well, and I want to note that nobody was in charge during the dive. There was no official leader. Everyone was Finnish and knew each other from other difficult dives they did together previously, like the Oyama Mine west of Helsinki. Patrick and Kai were the only ones in the group that dove in Plura before, when it was discovered a year prior with another diver. The dive was supposed to take 5 hours while using an underwater scooter, which is a device that propels them forward so they can swim faster. That's a really long time compared to most amateur divers who usually do 30-minute dives to 30 meters deep, but that'll be touched on later. That being said, Patrick was unofficially leading the way for H since he dove there before. They were an hour into their dive and already passed through the deepest part of the cave. It was on the turn back up when they approached a narrow opening that inclined at 110 meters deep. Patrick went through first, and H followed behind him. Patrick got a little bit ahead when he noticed H flashing his light, so he turned around and realized that he was signaling for Patrick to come over. Patrick saw H was caught up in the line and was starting to get nervous, which, according to what Patrick says in the documentary about this event, always happens whenever you get stuck that deep. So he tried to calm H down and gave him a cylinder of gas to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in his system, since he was at risk of overloading his rebreather. If he did that, he would be at risk for hypercapnia, which is carbon dioxide poisoning, and the deeper you are, the faster carbon dioxide absorbs into the bloodstream. It's very dangerous and can be deadly because, aside from the poisoning part, even mild cases cause confusion and disorientation. Clearly not a state you want to be in. So H had the new gas cylinder and needed to switch mouthpieces, but in his panic, while he was switching over, he started swallowing water. Patrick looked up to see nothing in H's mouth and tried to push his mouthpiece back in, but it didn't work. Once he breathed in the water, it was pretty much over, and he watched his friend die. Patrick sat there for a minute, after H already passed, trying to get him out from where he was stuck at. I'm sure he wanted to bring his friend's body home, but the more pressing matter on his mind was the fact that the other team would be going through there soon, and their only path through would be blocked if he couldn't get H out. After some time, he realized he was breathing entirely too fast and needed to calm down and think. And he eventually realized he wasn't going to be able to get him out, and was pushing his luck with hypercapnia himself and lengthening his decompression time. He spent about 20 minutes at the depth of 110 meters, adding hours onto his decompression time before he could even exit the water. So he left. The first part of Team 2's dive was similar to Team 1. Everything was going relatively smoothly, and Vesa was the diver leading the group. At around 130 meters, he heard a faint beeping, but wasn't sure whose equipment it was. Once they got through the deepest turn and started swimming back up to the narrow opening, Vesa sees a stuck diver. He had to quickly figure out what he was going to do. Try to squeeze through or turn around and swim back, down through the deepest part of Plura, and try to survive what would end up being a very long dive back to the surface. Vesa chose to try and push past the dead diver, and all he can hear is H's equipment beeping loudly beside him. At the same time, Yu and Kai were swimming up behind him when Kai saw Yu in front of him looking like he was having trouble. It looked like Yu was calling out to him, so Kai started moving closer and figured something was wrong. But everything happened so quickly that by the time he reached Yu, he was dead. Kai had to quickly figure out what to do, so he just went past him, and when he did, he realized more people were dead. Right in front of him was H's body, stuck in the narrow opening, and right next to him was Vesa, who was still trying to squeeze past H. He got stuck and was struggling to get through, so Kai immediately said nope and decided to turn back and go back the way he came. He wasn't sure Vesa would make it through, and he didn't know what was beyond the blockage. He didn't know if Patrick was stuck too, if the path was clear. He had no idea what else he might run into, and if Vesa would even be able to make it through there at all. And honestly, he didn't want to find out. So he left not knowing if Vesa would live or die, next to whoever was stuck beside him, and with Yu floating behind them. Honestly, he left not knowing if he would make it back himself either. Vesa would struggle to get through the blockage for 15 minutes before he would eventually catch up to Patrick. His struggle added another 3 hours to his decompression time. Patrick surfaced first, and with 80 minutes left in his decompression time, Vesa was so low on gas, he was forced to surface. Soon after that, Vesa started feeling mild pain in his elbows and knees, a sign that he was suffering from decompression sickness. The pain would increase over the next few hours. In the meantime, Kai would be diving until the next morning. It would take him 11 hours to finish what was supposed to be a 5 to 6 hour dive. And when he reached the pond again, it was iced over. He had to find a weak spot of ice to break through before he ran out of air. Patrick, Vesa, and Kai all had to be treated for decompression sickness. And Vesa had a spinal injury that kept him from diving for the foreseeable future. If that wasn't bad enough, when the police arrived, they realized they needed foreign assistance and banned all diving in the area. So the international team that they brought in to help tried to retrieve the bodies, but couldn't. So the Norwegian police closed the cave. They decided to abort the operation because after assessing the difficulty of the dive and considering the lives already lost, they felt it was too dangerous. The more dives they did, the greater the risk since they couldn't get past the dead divers. The chief of police then went and decided to close the cave permanently. And here's the justification made at the joint conference.
We couldn't even access that part of the cave because the passage is blocked by the first victim, so it's impossible to get past. Every single dive that we do to those depths in a cave is a risk, and the more dives we do, the more risk there is. This really is just too dangerous. It's not worth to risk your own lives to complete this task.
The surviving divers couldn't stand the idea of leaving them there, and didn't even want to think about how their families and other friends would feel about it. Yes, it was a grave, but not the right one for their friends. They could barely sleep just thinking about their friends being left down in the cave, especially when they themselves were the right team, with all of the right equipment and experience to recover them. It would have been just completely messed up to them if they didn't go there themselves and bring their friends home. Knowing and feeling that way didn't change the fact that diving was banned in the cave, though. So trying to bring their friends home was incredibly illegal. But Johnny Law wasn't going to get in their way. Planning a secret illegal dive to an area that has already taken your friends' lives is too difficult for recovery divers trying to retrieve them. And if you run into trouble, there will be no sympathy on your part. I mean, that's a lot. And they still said, let's go, okay, because they made a plan and they went out and got other divers that they knew would be up for the job too. In total, there were 27 people that would be part of the recovery operation. They needed 2 teams of support divers at both ends of the cave to give them the best chance of pulling it off. A diver named Sammy, along with Patrick and Kai, would dive the deepest. They were going to be the ones to get their friends. They would free them and bring them up to shallower water. Sammy was friends with the original group. Sammy, Patrick, and Kai were the ones who first dove the length of Plura Cave the year prior. At the time of the accident, he was teaching a diving course in Mexico. Vesa couldn't dive. He was going to be the surface manager, and he would monitor things from on land because of his injuries from the original dive. They had a plan and researched things like rigor mortis, transportation of the bodies, if it was possible animals got to them, and they tried to remember how they were positioned. Kai claimed at the time, and in his denial of interview request years later, that he doesn't remember much about the accident with you. He's pretty vague about what actually happened, and doesn't really ever elaborate beyond it looked like he was struggling, and then he was gone. So for that part of the recovery, they were going in a bit blind. They had a plan for communication and potentially getting caught. They wanted to be sure the media didn't find out anything, because then it would be a chaotic mess. And if they were asked what they were doing, they were basically just going to say they were casually diving or play dumb. The recovery mission was a 6-day trip. They would be actually on location, diving for 4 days, and have a day for travel on each end to and from the site. They hoped to have everything done within 3 dives. About 7 weeks after the accident, they were ready to put everything into action. Day 1 was spent bringing a huge amount of gear to the dry cave and bringing it up and down the hill. Day 2 was spent setting up equipment, placing 50 gas cylinders along the diving route and setting up a pocket of air on the Plura side. It's called an underwater habitat, and the divers can rest during their decompression and get out of the water and eat, take off their masks, and just rest. The night of day 2, it was decided. On the first dive, they would get H in both scooters. Then they would go back for U and more gear. The idea was to retrieve extra gear in case their families wanted to sell things for some extra income. The following evening, Team 1, who were Sammy, Patrick, and Kai, went out and cut a huge entrance into the ice on the Plura side before gearing up to go. Team 2 was whatever dive group planned to meet them from the dry side. They knew they couldn't recover them starting from the dry cave because Sammy was a part of the original international recovery team. And when they originally surveyed the site of where H got stuck, Sammy and the international team realized he wasn't able to be freed from that side, and he blocked their ability to even reach U. In the weeks since the accident, none of the survivors slept well and were restless, so their head had to be on right. The entire time just thinking about if they would be able to handle seeing their friends, and then pushing it away to deal with later since they didn't want to work themselves up. They thought about the risks, the worst-case scenarios of the ones going to recover the victims becoming victims themselves. All of it weighed heavily on them. And on top of that, Patrick promised H's wife that he would bring him home. So that's why they felt even more obligated to do it. Team 2 sat and waited for 100 minutes after Team 1 started their dive, at the bottom of the Stein dry cave where it met water. At 3:50, Team 2 entered the water. They made it over 50 meters deep when they ended up turning around. Laura, one of the assisting divers, may have been suffering from decompression sickness. She felt it while underwater, but it really hit her when they surfaced. She felt like her hand had been chopped off, which made everyone worried if the operation itself was jeopardized. Because she may be out of the plan now, but if she couldn't sit in a car to be driven for help, and they had to call for a helicopter or emergency services, everything would be blown. So they waited it out and just had her in the water, breathing oxygen, before they pulled her out and had her sit on the ground and breathe and wait to see if everything would be fine. In the meantime, Team 1 was still on their dive. It's not clear what happened, but on the descent, Kai and Patrick had some type of discourse. It seemed like Kai wasn't a fan of Sammy swimming further behind them because he was the one towing extra air tanks. I think it made him nervous, and then once they hit 85 meters, Kai lost Patrick. He was calling out for him, asking where he was at. He couldn't hear a response and turned around to look for him, still calling out and trying to find Patrick's lights. When he did find him, Patrick wasn't on course. He was off the path, and it looked like his line was wrapped around a rock in the area that he was in. Immediately, Kai felt like things weren't right. Too many things were adding to the already huge risk they were taking. So he ended up turning around to leave and let Sammy and Patrick continue without him. With everything that happened, the repeated accidents with friends, the deaths he witnessed, he wasn't even sure if he enjoyed the sport anymore. He loved the sport, but the friends he dove with were causing him so much stress and concern that he wasn't sleeping well anymore. Diving wasn't bringing the same joy, and he just felt he wasn't in the correct state of mind to dive. But Sammy and Patrick continued on, and at 120 meters, they saw U. He was upside down in the tunnel. That particular area wasn't tight. Kai and Patrick were able to easily swim past him with plenty of space to continue on. 20 meters further, H was in the same position he was before. They had to cut off his tanks and things they could reach, and then they tied the towing rope around him. They swam back a bit, towards the end of the rope and started trying to pull H out that way. They couldn't get him out at first, so they took a break to get their breathing back under control. And then they tried again and were able to free him. They went through the tunnel and started the return dive before reaching a decompression stop at 60 meters and meeting with the safety diver. They tell the diver they got H out and you wasn't stuck, just floating free in the water, so they would be back tomorrow. They make sure everyone's okay, and then the safety divers left, while Patrick and Sammy decompressed. While they were decompressing, Sammy asked Patrick if he thought Kai would come back and dive for the next part of the recovery plan. Patrick confessed that he didn't think Kai would ever dive with them again because he could see it in his eyes that morning. Kai even told Patrick that he didn't really want to do the dive. To me, that just seems like him turning back earlier was the right choice. He clearly wasn't in the right state of mind, and he probably shouldn't have gone down to begin with. It was kind of lucky he didn't get into a situation that would have put everyone at risk. Patrick finished his decompression time before Sammy, so he continued on to the dry cave entrance where the others were waiting. While they all waited for Sammy to finish up his dive, which, by the way, their dives were over 6 hours, Patrick told them how happy he was because he had been so restless since the accident that killed their friends over a month ago. It was like a weight off his shoulders, knowing they freed them, and now that the hard part was over, they were so close to bringing them home. He had a snack and drink while they waited, and before long, Sammy surfaced, immediately asking if there was something warm to drink. Sammy, Patrick, and Vesa sat around while Sammy ate his cup of noodles and had a real talk about what happened the last time they were in Plura. They spoke about how this time they were careful going through the tight spots and how every time they dive, they should be doing extra dives, not just trying to go straight through. They came to the stark realization that they felt the accident was their fault. They should always do extra dives. It wasn't right that they would try to dive straight through without doing test and exploration dives first, especially since the two Yaris hadn't been in there before. But hindsight is 20/20, and actually in the documentary, they showed dive footage, and with how tight some spots were, they were hitting their tanks and equipments on the walls. I was shocked and a little nervous someone's suit would rip. In water that cold and deep, it would have been a death sentence, honestly. After the success of day 3's dive, they were feeling good and confident. They knew not to feel like it would be an easy dive the next time they went, but they just couldn't help it. Kai decided to not dive and instead wait on land in the dry cave, while another diver would replace him in helping to get the divers through the narrow opening. They made a plan on who would do what, bring what gear, cut what pieces, and then set off. On their way to U, they encountered a problem. They had a split line, so instead of it being just their main line to follow, another line was branching off of it, and Patrick wasn't sure where to go. Luckily, Sammy remembered and pointed him in the right direction. They continued and eventually reached 120 meters, where U was. When they got there, they started trying to cut off his gear, but it wasn't budging. They were struggling and moving around, trying to get the gear off so much that they were bumping into the cave walls and it started collapsing. Rocks were falling around them. And right around that time, Team 2 left their position in the dry cave and started the dive to meet Team 1. 5 hours later, Patrick surfaced and said they completed the job. He confessed to hitting the 90-meter mark and being nervous he brought the wrong regulator and had to calm down. At one point when they were bringing their gear up from the dry cave, Sammy started joking about if Patrick noticed the rocks falling. And the way he told the story was lighthearted, but the look in the eyes of the others that were listening was concern. It kind of gave the impression that Patrick could be on the reckless side of things. The next morning, Sammy called the lead investigator for the incident on speakerphone with all of the divers involved in the room and told him that they recovered the bodies and left them in the dry cave, and they retrieved one scooter, one dive computer, and a tank. The investigator sounded a little stunned and didn't know what to say, just that someone would be in contact with him. That evening, they went to the cave and had a ceremony where they put their friends in airtight body bags and left them in the cave. Patrick was very insistent on the body bags since he used them for work as a firefighter. Patrick went on to receive a medal from the president of Finland for the retrieval. It was the first-class medal of the White Rose of Finland, and their reasoning was because the Norwegian and British divers couldn't do it, but he did. Sammy and Vesa went on to do media about everything. A while later, Kai, Vesa, Sammy, and Patrick met up at a cave to try and go for a dive. Kai hadn't dove since the accident and wanted to test and see if he could overcome his fear to do it again. I guess he felt most comfortable going with the only other people who would understand his mindset. Patrick and Sammy were of the mindset that they had to dive. They couldn't not do it. They loved it way too much. Actually, Patrick said his wife asked his kids if he should be allowed to dive anymore. And the children were basically like, he has to dive because if he doesn't, he's angry and irritable. As for Vesa, at the time of the group dive, he still hadn't decided if he would take that risk again after the spinal injury he received in Plura. He was having a hard time knowing that trying to rationalize the trips he took to dive, the expenses, and the risks were something that people outside of the sport just can't rationalize. In the end, the Norwegian police didn't press charges on them for the illegal recovery, and it seems like they were able to move on as well as you can after something like that happens. The documentary about this entire event is called Diving into the Unknown, and I just wanted to hop on really quickly since the time of recording this episode, something has happened. I apologize for my voice. I am a little under the weather, but after the cave was closed, it was reopened again in 2014 for divers to explore. The gear that the original team wasn't able to retrieve from their friends was left in the cave as kind of a memorial and a warning for future divers. After it was reopened, it was restricted. You had to have certain certifications to access certain parts of the cave. Only the most advanced divers were allowed to swim through the entirety of the cave. Just yesterday, April 3rd, 2024, an American diver lost their life in the Plura Cave. There isn't a lot of information out about it yet, but once an investigation is concluded, if there's enough information for me to make an episode off of, I'll be sure to update you guys on what happened with that. My thoughts go out to the divers who lost their lives in this cave and to anyone who knew them. It was just kind of shocking to me that right after I put together this episode, I do a quick Google search just to try and fact check some things and saw the news. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware that this cave is still open for diving and people are still, unfortunately, losing their lives in it. So if you are a diver, please just be careful out there. And of course, as always, sources can be found at occurrencepod.com, which is linked in the show notes. Leave a review or comment of your thoughts on the Plura Cave disaster. Stay safe, and see you next Thursday.